The night of March 22nd, 1945, was dark and cold along the Rhine River at Oppenheim, Germany. The thunder of artillery echoed across the water as American soldiers of the Third Army crossed in assault boats, their oars cutting through the black current. On the western bank, General George S. Patton stood watching, his ivory-handled pistols gleaming in the firelight from the barrage, a cigar clenched between his teeth and a predatory grin on his weathered face. He turned to his aide, Colonel Charles Codman, who had just arrived with a status report. The colonel was carrying a bottle of champagne, clearly anticipating a celebration. Patton took a long drag on his cigar before speaking, his voice dripping with satisfaction. Not a single boat. Not one goddamn kraut boat to stop us. Montgomery's been planning his crossing for months, building up his supplies, coordinating his air support, making his meticulous plans. We did it in 24 hours with what we had on hand. The artillery fire intensified, illuminating the far shore, where American infantry were already establishing a foothold. Codman popped the champagne cork, and it flew off into the darkness. He poured 2 glasses as Patton continued to watch the crossing with the intensity of a predator watching prey. General, the Third Army is across. Casualties are minimal. The Germans never saw it coming. Our intelligence says they had pulled most of their best troops north to face Montgomery's expected crossing. We caught them with their pants down. Patton took the champagne glass and raised it high, the golden liquid catching the reflected light of exploding shells across the river. His voice rang out with characteristic bravado. To the Third Army, and to beating that overdressed British peacock to the punch. Montgomery's sitting up north with his 1,000,000 men, his 1,000 planes, his artificial moonlight, his smoke screens, planning Operation Plunder like it's the second coming of Christ. And here we are, already across the Rhine and pushing into Germany. They drank deeply. Patton walked back toward his headquarters, a commandeered German building that still smelled of enemy occupation. Inside, maps covered every wall, showing the Third Army's lightning advance across France and now into Germany itself. Red arrows marked their progress. Blue arrows showed Montgomery's planned operation to the north. Codman followed him inside, closing the door against the cold night air. He hesitated before asking his next question, knowing Patton's volatile temperament. "Sir, should we inform Schaff immediately? General Eisenhower will want to know about the successful crossing." Patton turned from the map, that sly smile playing across his face again. He poured himself another glass of champagne and settled into a chair, stretching his legs out before him like a satisfied cat. "Let's give it a few hours. Let Montgomery have his big day tomorrow. He's earned it, after all, planning for 6 months while we've been fighting. Besides, I want our boys well established on the other side before anyone at headquarters starts worrying about coordination and caution and all that staff officer nonsense." He paused, swirling the champagne in his glass, watching the bubbles rise. His voice took on a more reflective tone, though the edge of competition never left it. "You know what kills me, Codman? Montgomery is a good general. Careful, methodical, doesn't waste his men. But he doesn't understand that war is about speed and audacity. You see an opening, you take it. You don't schedule it for 3 months from now after you've brought up every supply truck in the European theater. Meanwhile, 60 miles to the north, near the town of Wesel, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery stood in his command post, binoculars raised, watching the final preparations for Operation Plunder. The dawn of March 23rd was breaking over the Rhine, and it would be a dawn unlike any the river had seen. Thousands of troops were assembling, artillery pieces were being positioned, and overhead, the drone of Allied aircraft filled the sky. Montgomery was immaculate as always, his uniform pressed to perfection, his beret set at precisely the right angle. Everything about him spoke of order, control, and careful planning. His aide, Brigadier Noel Chavas, stood nearby, also watching the preparations with satisfaction. The field marshal lowered his binoculars and spoke in his crisp, clipped accent, every word measured and precise. "Operation Plunder is proceeding exactly as planned, Brigadier. Every unit is in position. Every artillery piece has its target. Every aircraft knows its mission. This is how one conducts a major river crossing, not with reckless improvisation, but with careful preparation and overwhelming force. When we cross that river, the Germans will know they've been hit by a steamroller." Chavas nodded his agreement, about to respond, when an intelligence officer came hurrying across the muddy ground, his face showing clear discomfort. He saluted sharply, but his hesitation was obvious. Montgomery turned to him, his expression shifting to one of mild irritation.
"Well, Captain, what is it? You look like a man who swallowed something unpleasant." The intelligence officer swallowed hard before speaking, his words coming out in a rush. "Sir, I have a report from SHAEF headquarters. It's somewhat delicate, sir. General Patton crossed the Rhine last night at Oppenheim. The Third Army is establishing bridgeheads on the eastern bank as we speak." The silence that followed was profound. Around them, the sounds of preparation continued, artillery rumbling, engines roaring, men shouting orders. But in that small circle around Montgomery, time seemed to stop. The field marshal's jaw tightened, his knuckles whitening on his binoculars. When he finally spoke, his voice was ice. "Last night, before Operation Plunder? Are you absolutely certain of this information?" "Yes, sir. The report came directly from Third Army headquarters. General Patton crossed approximately 14 hours ago. Intelligence suggests he encountered minimal resistance and has already pushed several miles inland from the river." Montgomery's face had gone rigid, his famous composure cracking just slightly around the edges. He handed his binoculars to Chavas with exaggerated care, as if afraid he might crush them in his grip. That impossible, glory-seeking, reckless cowboy. This is exactly what I warned Eisenhower about. Patton has no sense of coordination, no understanding of the larger strategic picture. He just charges ahead like a bull in a china shop, and damn the consequences. He turned to the intelligence officer, his voice sharp as a blade. "Get me General Eisenhower immediately. I don't care if he's asleep, eating breakfast, or conferring with the Almighty himself. I want him on the telephone now." At SHAEF headquarters in Reims, France, General Dwight D. Eisenhower was not asleep, nor eating breakfast, nor conferring with anyone particularly important. He was, in fact, sitting at his desk with his head in his hands, rubbing his temples, trying to stave off what he knew was going to be a monumental headache. His deputy, Air Chief Marshal Arthur Tedder, stood near the window, looking out at the gray French morning. Eisenhower spoke without looking up, his voice weary. "God damn it, I knew this would happen. The moment I got the report from Patton last night, I knew exactly how this would play out. Patton crosses, Montgomery finds out, and now I'm going to spend the next week refereeing a pissing contest between two of the most difficult personalities in the entire Allied command structure."
Tedder turned from the window, his British accent smooth and diplomatic. To be fair, Ike, Patton's crossing, was brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. Opportunistic, certainly. But isn't that what we want from our field commanders? He saw an opening, he had the resources, and he took it. Caught the Germans completely off guard. We're across the Rhine with minimal casualties. That's a win by any measure. Eisenhower finally looked up, his face showing the strain of commanding the largest military operation in history while managing egos that could fill football stadiums. I know that. You know that. Hell, even Montgomery knows that deep down. But Monty's going to see it as a personal insult. He's been planning this crossing for months, coordinating with the RAF, bringing up supplies, calculating every detail. And then Patton just waltzes across the river like he's crossing a stream in Kansas. An aide knocked and entered without waiting for permission. A sign of urgency. General, Field Marshal Montgomery, on the line from Germany. He's quite insistent on speaking with you immediately. Actually, sir, he's shouting. Eisenhower took a deep breath, straightened his shoulders, and picked up the telephone. Even from across the room, Tedder could hear Montgomery's raised voice crackling through the line. Montgomery's voice came through loud and clear, trembling with fury. Eisenhower, this is intolerable. Absolutely intolerable. Patton has deliberately undermined Operation Plunder. His reckless grandstanding could have compromised the entire northern offensive. If the Germans had reinforced against him, they might have weakened my sector, and he would have alerted them to our plans. Eisenhower's voice remained level, though his jaw tightened. Monty, I need you to calm down and listen to me. The Third Army crossed successfully, with minimal casualties. Patton found a weak point in the German defenses and exploited it. That's his job. It's a victory for the Allies. Montgomery's response came back even more heated. Calm down? How can I calm down when one of your generals is running around like a Wild West gunslinger, completely disregarding coordination and planning? This is typical American cowboy tactics. No coordination, no planning, just blind aggression and a hunger for headlines. Eisenhower's patience was wearing visibly thin now. His knuckles whitened on the telephone receiver. General Patton was following his orders to advance when opportunity presented itself. He found an opportunity. He seized it. That's what aggressive commanders do, Monty. I would have expected you to understand that, given your own successes. There was a pause, and when Montgomery spoke again, his words were clipped and formal. I demand that Patton be relieved of command immediately. He's a liability to the Allied effort, a loose cannon who cannot be trusted to follow proper military protocol. If you won't remove him, I shall have no choice but to take this matter to the Prime Minister. Churchill will understand the gravity of this breach of military discipline. Eisenhower's expression hardened into something like granite. His voice dropped to a tone that suggested this conversation was over. I am not relieving Patton, Monty. He's one of my best field commanders, and he just successfully crossed the Rhine. That's my final word on the subject. There was a click as Montgomery hung up without another word. Eisenhower slammed down the receiver hard enough to make the bell inside ring. He looked at Tedder with exhaustion and exasperation warring on his face. Jesus H. Christ, he's actually going to Churchill. He's actually going to bother the Prime Minister with this schoolboy rivalry nonsense in the middle of the final push into Germany. Tedder moved away from the window, his expression sympathetic. He's serious, then. He's really going to make this an Anglo-American political issue? Eisenhower was already reaching for the phone again. Get me the Prime Minister's office in London. I need to speak with Churchill before Montgomery does. Maybe I can head this off before it becomes an international incident. That evening in London, Winston Churchill sat in his study at 10 Downing Street, surrounded by maps, reports, and the ever-present cloud of cigar smoke. He was 70 years old, worn down by 5 years of war, but his mind was still sharp as ever. He wore his famous siren suit, comfortable and practical, and held a brandy in one hand while studying the latest reports from the front with the other. His secretary, Elizabeth Leighton, entered quietly and waited for him to acknowledge her presence. He didn't look up from his maps as he spoke. "Yes, Elizabeth? What is it?" "Field Marshal Montgomery is on the telephone from Germany, Prime Minister. He says it's urgent and must speak with you immediately." Churchill took a sip of brandy and a puff of his cigar before responding, still not looking up from his maps. It's always urgent with Monty. Everything is urgent when you're that particular about how things should be done. "Very well. Put him through." He picked up the telephone, settling back in his chair, preparing himself for whatever crisis Montgomery believed required the Prime Minister's immediate attention. "Field Marshal, what's so urgent that you're calling me instead of celebrating your crossing of the Rhine? I understand Operation Plunder was a success." Montgomery's voice came through the line, tight with controlled anger. "Prime Minister, I must speak frankly with you. General Patton has deliberately sabotaged Operation Plunder by conducting an unauthorized crossing at Oppenheim. He crossed the Rhine before our carefully planned operation, with no proper coordination, no adequate preparation, and purely for his own glorification." Churchill's eyebrows rose slightly. He set down his brandy and leaned forward. His interest piqued despite himself. "Unauthorized? I was under the impression that General Eisenhower authorized all movements of Allied forces in the European theater. Are you suggesting Patton acted without orders?" Montgomery's frustration came through clearly in his response. He had general orders to advance, yes, but he crossed before our operation. With no proper planning, no adequate preparation. It's grandstanding of the worst sort, and it's typical of the American approach to warfare. All thunder and lightning and no proper thought to coordination or the larger strategic picture. Churchill stood now, walking to his window overlooking the London streets, the telephone cord stretching across his desk. His voice took on a more measured tone. "I see. And what precisely is it you want me to do about this, Monty? What would you have me tell General Eisenhower?" "I want Patton relieved of command, Prime Minister. He's reckless, he's insubordinate, and his cowboy actions endanger Allied unity. Eisenhower won't act because the Americans protect their own. So I'm appealing to you to make them see reason." Churchill stood there for a long moment, looking out at London, the city that had endured the Blitz, that had stood alone against Hitler when all seemed lost. He took a long pull on his cigar, the smoke curling up toward the ceiling, as he chose his words carefully. "Let me make certain I understand this correctly, Field Marshal. You're calling me, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, in the middle of the greatest Allied advance into Germany since we landed at Normandy, to complain that an American general crossed the Rhine River too quickly. Is that an accurate summary of this urgent matter?" Montgomery's voice stiffened. "Prime Minister, With respect. This is about proper military discipline and coordination. This is about maintaining Allied unity and ensuring that operations are conducted according to plan, and not subject to the whims of glory-seeking individuals. Churchill's voice suddenly rose, the famous Churchill temper flaring to life. Anyone who had worked with him knew this tone, knew that the Prime Minister's legendary wrath was about to be unleashed. Field Marshal Montgomery, I have spent 5 long years of my life holding this alliance together. 5 years convincing President Roosevelt, and now President Truman, that Britain is a worthy and equal partner in this war. 5 years managing American egos and British egos and Russian egos, while good men die on battlefields from North Africa to Normandy. And you want me to jeopardize all of that because you're jealous?
Montgomery's protest came immediately. Sir, that's not fair. This isn't about jealousy. It's about proper military procedure, and Churchill cut him off, his voice thundering now. Not fair? I'll tell you what's not fair, Field Marshal. What's not fair is that you're bothering me with this petty rivalry when we're on the verge of defeating Nazi Germany. What's not fair is that you're turning a military victory into a personal grievance. He paused, taking a breath, moderating his tone slightly, but losing none of its force. Now let me ask you some questions, and I want honest answers. How many men did Patton lose in this crossing of his? There was a reluctant pause before Montgomery answered. Intelligence reports suggest minimal casualties, Prime Minister. Perhaps a few dozen wounded, even fewer killed. And he caught the Germans by surprise? Achieved tactical surprise? Yes, apparently the Germans had concentrated their forces expecting our crossing to the north. Patton's move was unexpected. Churchill's voice dripped with irony now. So let me understand this military disaster you're describing. An Allied general crossed a major river obstacle, achieved complete surprise, suffered minimal casualties, and is now advancing into German territory. And you want him fired for this catastrophe? Montgomery's voice was quieter now, more defensive. Prime Minister, it's the principle of the thing. Proper planning and coordination are essential to modern military operations. Patton's cowboy tactics might have worked this time, but they set a dangerous precedent for... Churchill exploded again, his voice filling the study. Principles? Precedents? Monty, the Germans are collapsing. Their armies are in retreat. This is not the time for worrying about whose ego gets bruised or whose press conference gets overshadowed. This is the time to pour through every gap in their defenses, cross every river, seize every bridge, and end this bloody war that has cost millions of lives. He was pacing now, the telephone cord tangling as he moved, his free hand gesturing emphatically even though Montgomery couldn't see him. I have just received word that your crossing was also successful. Congratulations, Field Marshal. Operation Plunder succeeded brilliantly. So now we have 2 successful crossings of the Rhine in 24 hours. The German defenses are breached in multiple places. This is magnificent news. This is exactly what we've been fighting for. And you want to turn it into a competition about who crossed first. Montgomery's voice was much quieter now. Prime Minister, this is about maintaining discipline and ensuring that the chain of command is respected. If generals can simply act without coordination... Churchill interrupted again, but his voice was softer now, more controlled, more dangerous in its quiet intensity. Discipline? Shall I tell you about discipline, Field Marshal?
Discipline is keeping your mouth shut when an ally succeeds at something you wanted to do first. Discipline is recognizing that we are all fighting the same enemy, and that it doesn't matter whether the killing blow comes from a British sword or an American rifle. Discipline is not calling the Prime Minister to demand that he interfere in the American chain of command. Because your feelings are hurt.
The silence on the other end of the line was complete. Churchill continued, his voice taking on a more somber, reflective tone. You are one of Britain's finest commanders, Monty. I mean that sincerely. El Alamein was a masterpiece of military planning and execution. You broke Rommel when we desperance this war by even one day. If it saves even one life, it's worth swallowing your pride. He picked up his brandy again, swirling the amber liquid thoughtfully. Do you know how many British families received death notices today, Monty? Or yesterday? Or will receive them tomorrow? Every single day this war continues, more mothers lose sons. More wives lose husbands. More children lose fathers. I see those numbers every morning, and they haunt my dreams every night. Montgomery's response was barely audible. I know, sir. I think of them too. Then please, for the love of God, and for the sake of those families, focus your considerable talents on ending this war, not on who gets credit for crossing a river first, not on whose photograph appears on the front page. History will remember both of you, I promise you that. History will remember Montgomery and Patton as the generals who broke into Germany and ended the Nazi regime. But right now, right this moment, I need you to get across that river with everything you've got and drive toward Berlin as fast as your armies can move. There was a long pause. Churchill could hear Montgomery breathing on the other end of the line, could imagine the field marshal standing in his command post, wrestling with his pride and his duty. Yes, Prime Minister. You're quite right, of course. I apologize for bothering you with this matter. Churchill's voice softened further, almost fatherly now. No apology necessary, Monty. I understand the frustration. Command is a lonely burden, and dealing with rivals like Patton would try anyone's patience. But you're better than this. You're better than petty jealousy.
Show me the Montgomery who won at El Alamein. Show me the general who planned and executed D-Day. That's the man I need now. Yes, sir. I won't disappoint you. I know you won't. Now, is there anything else you need from me? Any actual military matter I can assist with? No, sir. Thank you for your time and for your clarity. Good hunting, Field Marshal. Make me proud. Make Britain proud. I shall, Prime Minister. Goodbye. Churchill hung up the telephone and sat there for a long moment, staring at nothing, his cigar burning forgotten in his hand. He looked older than he had at the beginning of the conversation, the weight of the war visible in every line of his face. Elizabeth Leighton appeared in the doorway, as if she had been waiting for the conversation to end. Prime Minister, General Eisenhower is also calling from France. He says it's urgent. Churchill actually laughed, a short bark of amusement. Of course he is. The poor man is probably frantic that Montgomery called me first. Put him through, Elizabeth. He picked up the phone again, his voice resuming its characteristic growl. General Eisenhower. I suspect I know exactly why you're calling, and I can probably save us both some time. Eisenhower's voice came through, tense with worry. Mr. Prime Minister, I apologize profusely if Field Marshal Montgomery has troubled you with internal command matters. I assure you, I'm handling the situation and... Churchill interrupted, but his tone was warm. No apology necessary, Ike. I've just finished speaking with our field marshal. He's been reminded of certain realities, both military and political. I don't think you'll have any further trouble from that quarter, at least not about this particular matter." The relief in Eisenhower's voice was palpable.
"Thank you, sir. I can't tell you how much I appreciate that. This rivalry between Monty and Patton has been a constant headache. They're both brilliant commanders, but they have such different personalities and approaches. Managing them sometimes feels harder than fighting the actual war." Churchill chuckled, a sound of genuine amusement now. "I believe it, General. I truly do. Patton is like a force of nature, isn't he? All fury and fire and forward motion. And Montgomery is like a Swiss watchmaker, everything precise and calculated and perfectly timed. They're both exactly what we need, but trying to get them to work together is like trying to harness lightning and clockwork to the same machine." "That's an excellent way of putting it, sir." Churchill's voice became more serious. "Tell me honestly, Ike, how much longer do you think this war will last? If we maintain momentum, if Montgomery and Patton both drive hard into Germany from their respective crossings, if the Russians keep pushing from the east?" Eisenhower considered before answering. "If we can keep the pressure on, if we don't have any major setbacks, if the German resistance continues to collapse as it has been? I'd say weeks, Prime Minister. Maybe a month or two at the outside. The Wehrmacht is finished. They're running out of everything. Men, fuel, ammunition, hope. It's just a matter of maintaining the offensive." Churchill was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "Weeks. After 5 years of war, after all the death and destruction, after everything we've endured, it comes down to weeks. Sometimes I can hardly believe it, Ike. Sometimes I wake up and think it's 1940 again, and we're standing alone against the Nazi war machine. And then I remember that we're not alone anymore. That America came to our aid. That the tide has turned." His voice strengthened again. "Then weeks or months it shall be, General. And at the end of it, we'll have our victory parade. We'll march through Berlin or London or Paris, and Montgomery and Patton can stand on opposite sides of the reviewing stand and glare at each other to their heart's content. But until then, until the last German soldier surrenders, I need both of them focused on the enemy. Can you ensure that?" Eisenhower's response was firm. "You have my word, Mr. Prime Minister. I'll keep them both pointed in the right direction. Toward Berlin, not toward each other. Good man. You know, Ike, I'll let you in on a little secret. When this war is over, and historians write about it, they're going to say that the alliance between Britain and America was smooth and harmonious, that we worked together in perfect cooperation to defeat the Axis powers. They'll make it sound like it was easy and inevitable." He took a long pull on his cigar. "But you and I will know differently, won't we? We'll know about all the arguments and disagreements, all the clashing egos and competing strategies. We'll know about nights like this, when victory almost got derailed by personal rivalries. And we'll know that holding this alliance together was sometimes harder than fighting the war itself." Eisenhower laughed softly. "I think you're right, sir. The history books will make it all seem much simpler than it was. Well, perhaps that's for the best. Perhaps future generations don't need to know how close we came sometimes to letting our own arguments slow us down. Perhaps it's enough that we succeeded in the end." "Yes, sir. Mr. Prime Minister, thank you again for handling Montgomery.
I know it's not your responsibility to manage Allied military commanders, but your intervention may have saved us all a great deal of trouble." Churchill's voice was warm. "Nonsense, Ike. We're all in this together. Now go win this war, General. I'm tired of it. Britain is tired of it. The world is tired of it. Finish it off and let us all go home." "Yes, sir. I'll do exactly that. Good night, Mr. Prime Minister. Good night, General. And Ike, when you talk to Patton, tell him congratulations from me. That was a hell of a crossing, even if it did cause diplomatic complications. I'll tell him, sir. Though knowing Patton, he'll probably be more pleased about annoying Montgomery than about the congratulations." Churchill laughed, a genuine belly laugh this time, undoubtedly. "Good night, General." He hung up the phone and turned to Elizabeth, who had been waiting patiently throughout the conversation. "Elizabeth, take a note. To Field Marshal Montgomery. Further to our telephone conversation this evening, I want to express my complete confidence in your continued leadership of Allied ground forces in the northern sector. Operation Plunder has been a triumph, and I look forward to your continued advance into Germany. Britain is proud of you and your men. Signed, Winston S. Churchill, Prime Minister." Elizabeth finished writing and looked up. "Shall I send a similar message to General Patton, sir?" Churchill considered this, then shook his head slowly. "No, I think not. Patton doesn't need encouragement from me. That man has enough confidence for 3 generals. Besides, it would only irritate Montgomery further if he found out, which he inevitably would. Let Eisenhower handle the Americans. I've done enough alliance management for one evening." He walked back to his maps, looking at the arrows showing Allied advances into Germany from west and east. The endgame was finally in sight. "You know, Elizabeth, in all my years of political life, through all the crises and challenges I've faced, I don't think anything has tested my patience quite like managing military egos. I'd rather negotiate with Stalin than referee another argument between Montgomery and Patton." Elizabeth smiled slightly. "But you did it, sir. You kept them focused on winning the war. This time, yes. But there will be other times before this is finished. Patton will do something else, audacious and unauthorized. Montgomery will object to some American action or another. And I'll be here, trying to keep the alliance from fracturing over hurt feelings and wounded pride." He sat back down, heavily, in his chair. "Still, I suppose that's part of my job. Keeping the coalition together, smoothing over the rough patches, reminding everyone that we're fighting Hitler, not each other. It's not glorious work, but it's necessary. It's more than that, sir. It's essential. Without you holding things together, the alliance might have fallen apart long ago." Churchill waved dismissively, but looked pleased nonetheless. Perhaps. Or perhaps Roosevelt or Eisenhower or someone else would have done it. History has a way of producing the right person for the moment. Though I confess I do seem to have a talent for managing difficult personalities. Years in Parliament prepared me well for dealing with temperamental generals. He looked at the clock on his mantel. It was late, well past midnight now. "You should get some sleep, Elizabeth. Tomorrow will bring fresh crises, I'm sure. There's always something. What about you, sir? You look exhausted. I'll sleep when the war is over. For now, there's still work to be done." But Elizabeth had already left, knowing that arguing with Churchill about sleep was futile. He would work until dawn if necessary, sustained by brandy and cigars and sheer willpower. Churchill sat alone in his study, surrounded by maps and reports, the weight of 5 years of war pressing down on his shoulders. Somewhere in Germany, Montgomery was planning his next move, mollified, but probably still resentful. Somewhere else in Germany, Patton was probably celebrating his successful crossing, already planning his next audacious move. And in France, Eisenhower was probably breathing a sigh of relief that World War III hadn't broken out between his two most difficult subordinates. The Prime Minister picked up a pen and began writing in his diary, documenting the day's events for posterity. He wrote about the successful crossing of the Rhine, about the progress of Allied armies into the heart of Germany, about the approaching end of the Nazi regime. But he also wrote about the phone calls, about the rivalry, about the delicate work of holding alliances together in the face of competing egos. Future historians, he wrote, will judge us by our victories on the battlefield. They will study our strategies, our tactics, our military decisions. But they may never fully understand the personal dimensions of this war, the human conflicts that sometimes threaten to undermine everything we were trying to achieve. Today I was reminded that winning a war requires not just military skill, but diplomatic finesse, not just defeating the enemy, but managing one's allies. He paused in his writing, thinking about what the next weeks would bring. More advances, more victories, more arguments between commanders, more diplomatic crises to manage, and then finally the end. The surrender of Germany, the defeat of Hitler, victory in Europe. But even then he knew the work wouldn't be finished. There would still be Japan to deal with. There would be the question of post-war Europe, of Soviet ambitions, of maintaining the wartime alliance into a peacetime partnership. The end of one struggle would simply mark the beginning of another. He set down his pen and picked up his brandy glass, raising it in a solitary toast to the empty room. To victory, he said quietly, however it comes, whoever achieves it, whatever personal rivalries we have to endure along the way. He drank deeply, then returned to his maps, planning for tomorrow's challenges, preparing for the next crisis, doing the unglamorous but essential work of holding everything together until the final victory could be achieved. Outside his window, London slept, its citizens dreaming of peace, unaware of the late-night diplomatic drama that had just played out in the Prime Minister's study, unaware that their leader had spent the evening not planning military operations, but managing the egos and rivalries of Allied generals, unaware that sometimes the hardest battles of the war were fought not on the battlefields of Europe, but in telephone conversations between Allied headquarters. But Churchill knew. He had always known that war was as much about politics and personalities as it was about tanks and troops. And on this night, he had fought another small battle in the larger war, keeping the alliance intact, keeping Montgomery and Patton focused on Germany rather than on each other, ensuring that the final push toward victory wouldn't be derailed by personal grievances. It wasn't the kind of victory that would make headlines. There would be no medals awarded for it, no monuments erected to commemorate it. But in its own way, it was just as important as any battle fought on the Rhine, because without alliances, without cooperation, without someone to manage the inevitable conflicts that arose between strong-willed commanders, all the military brilliance in the world wouldn't be enough to win the war. Churchill finished his brandy, stubbed out his cigar, and finally admitted to himself that perhaps Elizabeth had been right. He was exhausted. He should sleep. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new crises, new opportunities for Montgomery and Patton to clash over something. But for tonight at least, disaster had been averted. The alliance held firm. The war would continue on its course toward inevitable Allied victory. And that, Churchill reflected, as he finally headed toward his bedroom, was enough for one evening's work.